The dust, it's starting to settle on what has been an extremely busy few days in the NHL and fantasy hockey worlds. And that's why you're back for another brand new episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Not everyone can be winners of this offseason, so we're taking a look at some of these teams that have just missed over the last couple of days. Let's get this paper.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Is going on, everybody? Welcome back inside the unofficial lab. We're on the road, baby, but we're still bringing that fantasy heat. It's the Wednesday edition of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Shout out to the everydayers, everybody out there holding us down, making us your first listen every single day. Steele and I see you and appreciate y'all. Couldn't be doing this show without everyone out there supporting the squad. Thank you so much. Make sure you smash that subscribe button. Drop us a 5-star review. Wherever you listen to your content, it means the world to both of us, and it helps us get better to bring you what you need to dominate your fantasy leagues. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for your first purchase. Terms apply. Steele, there's a lot of terms being applied around the NHL, and some of them aren't exactly making a whole ton of sense. Yesterday's episode, if you missed it, Steele and I were here breaking down all of our winners from the early free agency period and the offseason in general. And I think that's how I'm looking at this in general, Steele. Yeah, winners and losers from free agency the last 48 hours, but just overall, there has been some teams that I think have obvious issues that haven't addressed them. I don't know your list. I don't know who you're looking at, but I hope some of the ones that I have there on the screen, Wild, Canes, Sens, Kings, at least a couple of those, I think you're going to agree with me that I don't really know Wagwan right now with some of these teams. I'm going to throw it over to you because, like I said to you earlier off air, you and I will be breaking down every single team in the NHL over the next couple of weeks, player by player, what they did, what they didn't do, fantasy value. So I got some honorable mentions. I got 3 teams that I think really are going to be in tough next season to make the playoffs. And a lot of that has to do with their inability to make roster changes over the last 2 days, because I think it was you that pointed out to me very astutely. $1.2 billion in contracts handed out over the last 48 hours and counting. So there are teams out there who have improved, and now some teams that looks like they're kind of slacking in the mac. And who are you looking at?
Well, I got a few honorable mentions as well, but I'll wait to see who you toss out there for your top 3 worst teams to see if they are one of my honorable mentions. Okay. So there was a lot of disappointing teams out there. I'll wait for what you have to say on the honorable mentions or your top 3. But one of the teams that really did a poor job were the Anaheim Ducks. And I think GM Pat Verbeek hit the snooze button the entire day of free agency. I think he just forgot it was free agency frenzy day overall with the Anaheim Ducks. Okay. They had close to $30 million in cap space. They had 4 signings: Jansen, Harkins, Brett Leeson, Euro Vakinen, Isaac Lundstrom, like just a bunch of lower tier NHL players right now. And I understand they've got some things going on, within their roster right now, but they still had $25.7 million in cap space. They had so much to work with right now, and this does not seem like a destination that any NHL player wants to go to right now. Besides all the young talent they have, who they've drafted and via trade. Look, there's still a lot of young talent on this team, and they're going to continue to rise through the ranks over the next 3 to 5 seasons. They're going to continue to get better with those young players that they have in their lineup. Cutter Gauthier, now an Anaheim Duck. Leo Carlson, 2 years into his
lots
NHL
to like
career.
on the come up for sure.
Yeah, Troy Terry, Trevor Zegras, who was injured almost the entire season last year when he was healthy, didn't
Olin
play
Zellweger
well.
as well.
Mason McTavish. Don't worry, I'm getting to all these names. Olin Zellweger, Pavel Mintyukov. There's a lot of things to like about this Anaheim Ducks team and where their future is heading. But when you have 25.7 or even higher before those 4 signings that I mentioned, when you have that much money in cap space and you can't land even a top 20 top 25 free agent out there in the NHL. Something's going on and something stinks in Anaheim right now. And it seems like not a lot of, NHL veterans or players that have been in the NHL for time now and who have that NHL experience want to play or go to the Anaheim Ducks. They are a loser on my list because of the few signings that they made and really just no name worth mentioning fantasy value wise for what those signings bring to the Anaheim Ducks. So they are number one losers on my list.
I guess I don't disagree with the fact that I expected them to do a little bit more, especially with all that cap space that you mentioned. However, maybe this is just indicative of what Pat Verbeek thinks his team is at right now, and he just has to wait and see because this Ducks team has been
Seems
that
like what it is.
couple of years. And look, I agree with what you're saying. I did expect them to make more moves, but maybe with all of this young talent, they are just so much in a holding pattern to see what they have, especially in the net with Lucas Dostal. Maybe it's one more year before Verbeek really starts to make moves to see what he has with all of those pieces that you mentioned. However, I'm not going to disagree with you in terms of they are definitely on the list of teams that didn't do nearly enough to move the needle in the direction of being relevant. And I think that's more the more that I speak this out loud, Steele, maybe they are just so far away from moving that needle that he had to put the snooze button on. Is it a mistake? Was there a lot of opportunities out there, especially with the money they had to maybe advance this turnaround perhaps in Anaheim? Probably. So I'm here for it. Let me move on to a team, though, that I think you and I can both agree. Rob Blake was up against it with this Pierre-Luc Dubois situation. Really did cook Rob Blake's goose. And I understand he had to get out from under that, but they also lose Talbot. I know he was up and down. Talbot was their best goaltending option. Now they have Kemper and Dave Riddick as the pairing. Number one, that's a miss. I know there wasn't a ton of goaltending options out there. I don't know what Rob Blake tried to do. They lose Arvidsson and Talbot. They have to move out Pierre-Luc Dubois, and then the players they bring in, Joel Edmondson, 4 years at 3.85. I love what Joel Edmondson can bring with the physicality. He's a 30-year-old D-man who usually plays good only in the playoffs with back issues. That's a concern. You overpay Warren Fogle, who scores 20 goals for the first time in his career last year. 3 years, 3.5. That one maybe isn't as egregious because he's a little bit younger. Maybe there's more to like about his game. But you also still are going to have to pay Quentin Byfield, and they only really have, I believe, about $10 million in cap space deal. Help me out here if you think I'm off the rails. But when I look at this roster, and you and I have talked a lot about what we did like up front, and I think I have these line combos right here. Byfield, Kopitar, Kempe, Deneau, Fiala, Trevor Moore. Obviously some things to like. They bring in Tanner Jeannot. Maybe that's a nice little sandpaper move. But then when you combine what they lack, a lack of an ability to fill out the roster, and you look at the blue line, and then you look at what they're going to have in the cage, I don't know, Steele. Fantasy value still to be had. This is one of those things you and I try to separate. I think the Kings are in trouble in terms of what they're going to do in the standings. However, I still see fantasy value, but they're right at the top of my loser list.
Yeah, I think they have to be there as well, just really with the goalie department, because you make the trade for Darcy Kemper with Pierre-Luc Dubois. You get that cap hit out of there. Just to answer your question, by the way, they have $10.7 million in cap space. So they are going to have to sign Quentin Byfield. They are going to have to sign Arthur Kaliev. Quentin Byfield is obviously the top priority for the LA Kings. But again, the big question for this LA Kings team
Kaliev is going elsewhere probably.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I don't know what's going on with Kaliev, but Quentin Byfield is the top priority. And the big question mark for the second straight season is the goaltending with the LA Kings. You trade Pierre-Luc Dubois, you get his cap hit out of there. You bring in Darcy Kemper for $5.25 million over the next 3 years. We know Darcy Kemper. He's a Stanley Cup champion with the Colorado Avalanche. He had a very bad season with the Washington Capitals on a very question mark bad Washington Capitals team. I don't put all the blame on him, but he had a very bad season, as well as Charlie Lindgren just played very good when he was in the cage. So now you get Darcy Kemper. You have David Riddick for another year. You re-sign Phoenix Copley. These are two backup goaltenders that I am not comfortable with David Riddick and Phoenix Copley. I do, however, think that Darcy Kemper can regain his confidence for what we saw with the 2022 Colorado Avalanche when they won the Stanley Cup. So there's that. But again, there wasn't enough of a big splash. They also trade for Tanner Jeannot. They get Tanner Jeannot. They get Warren Fogle. Like you said, they get Joel Edmondson. There's some decent moves in there. A little bit of an overpayment with those 2 signings, like you mentioned. But overall, they could have done a lot more with with the money that they did have. But now the top priority is signing Quinton Byfield.
Only 2 teams last season allowed less goals against in the NHL: the Winnipeg Jets and the Florida Panthers. And there is obviously something to be said about perhaps that blue line overachieved a little bit.
Yeah.
But if they can run it back, Steele, I think it's a big if, in my opinion. And then you lose a good defensive forward like Arvidsson, and I know he was out for a big portion of last season. But you lose him, you lose Talbot. I just have some question marks about this LA Kings team when at the start or mid of last season, when they're going on nice runs, you and I were starting to really look at this team for obvious fantasy value, but maybe as one that could make some noise in the postseason. But without the goaltending, it's not going to happen. The rest of the episode, we're going to break down some teams that perhaps didn't address their goaltending situations nearly enough, or maybe they did a little bit too much. Cough, cough, Detroit Red Wings. The rest of the week, Steele and I will be breaking down every bit of NHL and fantasy news that you need. We got a little top 15 goalie breakdown lurking in the weeds. However, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. You got to be downloading the Game Time app. Steele and I have been using it to buy tickets for all of our favorite events throughout the season. Right now, it's Blue Jays baseball time, but wherever you're at, the MLB market, they have you covered for all of your favorite MLB events. In-zone ticket deals, views from your seat, everything that you need to know about getting the best ticket in the house. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the app today. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL. Get 20 bones off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account. Use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets. Lowest price guaranteed.
And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Continue to hit the subscribe button, the follow button, leave a 5-star review. We appreciate all that love and support you show us Monday through Friday, especially in the off season through the summertime. Thank you so much for tuning into these episodes. Flip and I appreciate y'all out there tuning in every single day, continuing the conversation of losers in NHL free agency day. I've got 2 more on my list. Again, honorable mention. I'm waiting for this team to be brought up because I see them on the board right here. But one of the losers for me were the Buffalo Sabres. I didn't think they did a good enough job of making the moves that they needed to make through the free agency day to address some of the gaps and openings throughout their lineup right now. And another team that was absolutely swimming in cap space. I understand you go out and buy out Jeff Skinner's contract. It was a little confusing to me because he was your 3rd leading goal scorer this past season and the 2nd leading point leader in the 2 previous seasons. I get it. $9 million. He's on the older side, 32, 33 years old. You go out and buy Jeff Skinner's contract. You now have to pay him just under $2.5 million each year for the next 6 years not to play for you. When you do that, you need to have some sort of plan in mind of where this team is going. And I understand, again, you had a down season with a lot of your roster: Tage Thompson, Alex Tuck, Rasmus Dahlin on the blue line. You go out and trade Owen Power. You get Owen Power for Casey Middlestat. Your future is looking very bright. We all know the young talent that the Buffalo Sabres have, but when you're swimming in that much cap space that they had, and you go out and only sign Jason Zucker for $5 million, Sam Lafferty, and Nicholas Aube-Kubel, it didn't make much sense to me with these 3 signings, with the amount of cap space that the Buffalo Sabres had, buying out Jeff Skinner, who for the last 3 years has been either the top 3 point scorer or goal scorer for the Buffalo Sabres. Again, $9 million was a big contract for Jeff Skinner for some, over exceeding seasons with the Buffalo Sabres. But for me, you didn't really address the things that you didn't really address what you had to address for the Buffalo Sabres. I think they're just backing up all these young guys they have right now. JJ Peterka,
That's
Tage
it.
Thompson, Zach Benson, Dylan Cousins,
Yes.
Jack Quinn.
That's it.
Jason Zucker, and
That's
Sam
it.
Lafferty. You add 3 players into your bottom 6 group. Jason Zucker, I think, again, he can bring value to your team, but $5 million for 1 year is a little bit of an overpayment for me.
Sure.
I think they're really just backing up this young core right now, but I would have liked to see a lot more from a Buffalo Sabres team that could have done a lot better in free agency. I mean, we saw a lot of goalies get taken off the board. You know, you're still rocking with Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Devin Levi. I get it. I like it. You probably could have brought in a third string goalie, a veteran presence for these young players. We just saw Detroit, who we're probably both going to talk about very, very soon, bring in 2 capable veteran, very capable goaltenders into their roster. But for me, the Buffalo Sabres make it to 2 on my list because I wasn't in love with the moves that they made. Again, not talking about those 3 moves, still tons of fantasy value among the Buffalo Sabres going into next season.
I think, Steele, just straight up looking at the numbers here, JJ Peterka coming off his rookie deal next season. Jack Quinn coming off the same 2 years. Zach Benson's going to be there. Both of UPL and Devin Levi, we don't know what they're going to do, but they're both due contracts this year and next. I think Kevin Adams is playing a bit of a long game here, hoping that some of these young pieces explode, and he's going to need some of this money that, it could have been splashed in the free agency market. Please go ahead.
And I take that back because the Buffalo Sabres also signed James Reimer, so they do bring in a capable third-string goaltender to really bring in that experience for Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Devin Levi. Again, they probably could have gone out there and gotten, potentially Cam Talbot. They could have gone out there and maybe got a little bit of a better goaltender to help if those 2 young goaltenders start to struggle. Regardless, I think they're just putting a lot of faith and backing up that young prospect, the young prospects and the young talent they have throughout their core right now. So again, I think they could have done a lot better with the free agent signings, but that's just me.
Yeah, we could be nitpicking there and comparing those kinds of goaltenders. However, Bowen Byram is also going to be needing some money after this upcoming season.
Yeah,
so I believe it's a bit of a long game. I would have placed a whole bunch of other teams ahead. They don't even get honorable mention for me. And let me spit those out for you so we can put some context in. The Calgary Flames, I know that the Calgary Flames are in a fire sale situation, so they don't deserve to be losers because Craig Conroy's hand is a little bit tied. Markstrom, that situation he knew he was going to have to move on from. I just needed to look at what is this team going to do only 2 years removed from being a legitimate threat. They're talking about maybe some teams trying to pluck Nazem Kadri out of there as well because everybody's seemingly available. So the the Flames are losers, the Red Wings as well. I know you're going to talk about them, so I'll just mention them very briefly as honorable mention because they swapped in and out with a couple of other teams here. And it's the Pittsburgh Penguins, Steele. What is it with Kyle Dubas now in Pittsburgh? You have Sidney Crosby off a 90 plus, almost 100 points. Did he get 100 points? I don't know. An amazing season. And Kyle Dubas did basically nothing to address that. And maybe I'm way off the mark here, and maybe it's because I'm so closely tied to the success of Sidney Crosby for obvious fantasy reasons. They bring in Kevin Hayes, Anthony Beauvillier, and Matt Grzelcyk. Sidney Crosby, Erik Karlsson, Malkin, and Chris Letang, they're great fantasy pieces. They are Hall of Famers. We know how good they are, Steele, but those 4, even with Sid, that's not good enough in the Eastern Conference, especially when the Atlantic Division did what they did. You talked about the Toronto Maple Leafs yesterday. The Florida Panthers are the Cup champions. We have the New Jersey Devils out here flexing muscle, adding all kinds of pieces. I just needed to come on here and say Pittsburgh Penguins, Red Wings, Flames, all 3 of those teams could have easily made this list, but I'm looking at 2 more teams that I'll mention very briefly around the break, but I think you can agree with me at the very least. Those 3 teams, especially Detroit and Pittsburgh, with true playoff aspirations, they just fumbled the bag in a very big way.
94 points for Sidney Crosby last year, and Kyle Dubas is doing nothing to support his captain in Pittsburgh. He's truly making it a Kyle Dubas team right now. He's
Yeah.
making his own little
Thanks a
mark
lot.
on. He's making a big mark on the Pittsburgh Penguins. So
Black eye.
we'll have to see. We'll have to see when we get to the Pittsburgh Penguins as a team down the road in the offseason about
Yes.
all their fantasy value, top 5 fantasy value pieces moving forward. Again, looming in the making, a potential Tristan Jarry trade in the future as well. There's a lot to talk about with this Penguins team, fantasy value wise and not fantasy value wise. 2 more teams for Flip, 1 more team for me after the break. Top 3 losers of free agency frenzy break coming up right after this. And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Continue to hit the subscribe, the follow button, leave a 5-star review. We appreciate all that love and support you show us Monday through Friday, through the off season, through the summertime. We know it's getting hot out there, but you're tuning into the hottest Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast of the summer, of the podcast realm out there. Keep tuning in throughout the summer. Flip, over to you, my friend.
Yep.
Second team that you believe deserves to be on the top 3 losers list of free agency frenzy.
Well, I know Steve Staios is a new GM in Ottawa, and I'm not trying to take a single opportunity missed to take a little pot shot at the Ottawa Senators franchise steal. You know we like to do that. However, considering everything that's gone down with you and I actually standing by this Ottawa Senators franchise in terms of this time last year headed into the season, you and I were talking at length about all of these options, especially on the rise. Jake Sanderson, Josh Norris, healthy, all of these options. All of those things might still actually shake out this season. But swapping Chychrun for Jensen feels weird. I understand they needed that right shot, but you just swapped out a younger, better version of a D-man who actually in Chychrun, fantasy and offense aside, played really well with Thomas Chabot in the defensive end. They were let down by poor goaltending. So I know he's a left shot defenseman and he was playing on his offside. Chychrun played great defensively for the Ottawa Senators for the most part with Thomas Chabot. So this trade for Jensen really doesn't make any sense for me. It makes a ton for the Washington Capitals. So number one, that one was weird. And then David Perron at 2 years for $4 million. I saw some of these comments out there that, another veteran presence in the room will take pressure off of Claude Giroux. Do you think Claude Giroux cares at all about the pressure that comes along with being a leader? This guy loves being a leader. He's been doing it his whole career to the 75-plus point tune. So all these Ottawa Senators fans out there trying to say David Perron's veteran presence, $4 million at 2 years could have gone to 2 other players to help this roster in a much better sense. I would have liked to see maybe another D-man and another depth forward at cheaper. How did that work out? I don't know. They just signed Shane Pinto as well. But for me, Steele, this was a missed opportunity considering how much was out there on the market. And the Ottawa Senators were so let down at points last year by the bottom 6 and by some of their bottom D pairings. They let Eric Brandstrom go. I know I'm rambling because I get heated about this Ottawa Senators team, but for me, the Ottawa Senators made some questionable moves, especially that Chychrun for Jensen deal. And I know everyone's going to probably jump on me and say Chychrun was all over the map. That one didn't make sense to me. You overpay Perron, you're a loser for me.
Look, they're an honorable mention for me. They don't quite make it onto the top 3 list, but I was very baffled as well with the David Perron signing, especially now that they already did. They move on from Matthew Joseph trying to get his cap off the books, but that didn't make any sense. He was at $2.7 million.
I like the Michael Amadio ad, if I just want to throw some credit.
The Michael Amadio ad is really good for their depth scoring and depth playability. But again, when you bring in David Perron for 2 years, $4 million a year, and then you're trying to get Matthew Joseph off the books, this is a guy who scored 12 more points than Matthew Joseph, and Matthew Joseph had almost $1.5 million cap hit less than what David Perron is making right now. Because on top of that, when Josh Norris comes back from the LTIR, you're going to have to put that back on the books. And currently, you only have $3.6 million in cap space, and Josh Norris is making just shy of $8 million. So you're going to have to move another contract to make space from Josh Norris. I will give Ottawa Senators the benefit of the doubt here. Steve
Yeah.
Stamkos had a lot of work to put
Yes.
into this team from the mess
Yes.
of what Pierre Dorian and the scouting staff, everybody else who was a part of a year or two ago Ottawa Senators, Steve Stamkos had to clean up that mess from them. So I will give him the benefit of the doubt. He's going to fix all of it. You know, he trades for Linus Ullmark. He gets the number one goalie. That's another reason why they don't make the top 3 losers list. I know it wasn't free agency frenzy. It was a trade with the Boston Bruins. Regardless, I still have very high expectations for this Ottawa Senators team going into next season. Lots to love about their young guys. They get Shane Pinto signed for the next 2 seasons. Shane Pinto is going to
Atlantic Division is much improved, but I agree.
Much improved. Shane Pinto is going to be a sought after fantasy hockey player for all GMs out there amongst Tim Stutzla, Brady Tkachuk, Drake Batherson, Claude Giroux. He's going to be in that mix with them. He might even crack the top 5, probably will crack the top 5 of fantasy value players amongst Ottawa Senators going to next season. My last team, though, to talk about.
Let's not forget Linus Ullmark as well, Steele.
Linus Ullmark for sure. My last team going into my last team for losers of free agency frenzy. It is the Detroit Red Wings. And again, it's for a lot of the same reasons that I was talking about with the Buffalo Sabres. They had over $22, $23 million in cap space. And I'm just going to throw this out there. I understand that they have to sign Lucas Raymond and Maurice Seider, who are both restricted free agents this season. Completely understand that they're probably going to throw the books at them. They're going to get over $7.5 million for each player. They are incredible for the Detroit Red Wings. But when you have that much talent in free agency going into July 1st and you don't address again your top 6 group, again, I love the top line of Dylan Larkin, Lucas Raymond, and Alex DeBrincat. Down season for DeBrincat, a little bit hot and cold at times. Sure he was. But the top 6, the second line, they re-signed Patrick Kane, but the second line of Patrick Kane, JT Compher, and Michael Rasmussen, that's not good enough. That is just not good enough to be continuing to play and potentially be a playoff team, like you just said, in that very tough Atlantic Division. There were a lot of great names out there in free agency that they could have gone after very easily to address a top 6 group, very, very top tier top 6 group in the NHL with what they have right now with that first line. Again, I like the Patrick Kane $4 million for 1 year. They could have gone out there and got another center, a second line center, or a second line left winger. Unfortunately, they don't. I understand a lot of their cap space is going to go towards Maurice Seider and Lucas Raymond, but you still would have had at least $6, maybe $5 million left in cap space to go out there and acquire a top 6 forward. They don't go out and do that. Steve Yzerman's plan, the Yzer plan, it doesn't seem to be coming to fruition as fast as he thought it was.
How about why does Justin Hall get $10.2 million last summer over 3 seasons? There's a first question. They also bring in Cam Talbot and Jack Campbell. So now you have Ville Husso, Jack Campbell, Alex Lyon, Talbot, Campbell, Lyon, and Ville Husso.
Yeah.
Maybe there's more moves to come that we're not understanding.
Make sense.
Patrick Kane makes a whole lot of sense. That might be their only win. Let's give them credit for that. Patty Kane came in at the back half of last season, scored 20 goals in, I think 40 or 50 games. They had a big push there to the postseason. They also bring in Eric Gustafsson. All of these guys are 32 plus. They lose Shane Gostisbehere, who also has been a very effective offensive fantasy piece over the last couple of seasons. So question marks abound. I have 2 teams to cop out at my third spot, and I'm going to spit them out real quick. It's the Carolina Hurricanes and the Minnesota Wild. You're not getting out of here, Steele, without me giving a little bit of heat to the Minnesota Wild. And actually, we all know probably why Billy G is handcuffed here. I had this number up in terms of how much money they still have tied up in both paying out Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. $14.7 million. So obviously he's navigating with some restrictions under the salary cap, even though it has gone up. But bringing in Yakov Trenin on a 4-year, $14 million deal along with Devin Shore, Travis Boyd, and Brendan Gaunce. This wasn't a playoff team last year, Steele. And with those additions, they are definitely not once again. And the Carolina Hurricanes, I know that they bring in Gostisbehere and Sean Walker and they address the losses on the back end. Those are still downgrades. There's not enough offense. They lose Jake Gensel. We are here blue in the face talking about the Hurricanes' offensive lack of depth. They lose Jake Gensel. They lose those pieces on the blue line. And to me, they are going to be in trouble. They still have a hand to play with Nakash and that RFA. There could be something coming there, and they have to throw some money at Seth Jarvis. So not all is lost. However, for me, considering how close they've been knocking on the door still, I thought the Carolina Hurricanes were going to do a little bit more to replace Jake Gensel. They do not. They make the list of losers along with the Minnesota Wild.
Both of those teams have to be on an honorable mention or make the list for losers of free agency. Again, a lot of restraints for the Minnesota Wild, so I completely agree that they deserve to be there. Again, this is one final year of Zach Parise and Ryan Suter at 7.37, just over $7.3 million. And
then Billy G gets busy.
And then he gets busy because over the next 4 years, they're only paying them just over $800,000 a year. So a lot of restraints for Minnesota. Again, it seems to be that way over the last 3 seasons where they make a lot of two-way contracts and a lot of lower tier NHL signings for them. The Yakov Trenov deal, I'm very intrigued with that. They trade for Jacob Lauko as well for the Boston Bruins. Very interested with what he brings into the table. Sure. Carolina Hurricanes as well. They lose a lot. They don't get enough in return for Jake Gensel, in my opinion. They lose out on a few different players throughout their depth chart. Stefan Nason going to the New Jersey Devils, a few on the blue line as well. Couldn't agree with you more. We'll get a lot more into Brady Shea as well, losing Brady Shea.
There you go.
We're going to get into a lot more of the depth of all and each of these teams throughout the summer. We're going to break down all fantasy value-wise, top 5 fantasy value players. We're going to bring in, over the next few weeks, a top 15 fantasy goaltender episode. Stay tuned for all of that. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Once again, go check out Locked On Sports Today, the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. You can also find it on the free Amazon Fire TV channel app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I. Have a great day. Good luck with all your bets out there in the summer, and we shall see you back here again tomorrow.
Peace.